There is a lake in the north of Ireland where the water holds memory. Not the sharp memory of recent things, but the slow kind, the kind that settles into stone and root and the cold mud beneath the surface. This lake has a name, though names matter less than the feel of a place, the way it sits in the landscape like a cupped hand holding rain. Lake Derravaragh. Say it slowly. Let the syllables roll like water over smooth rock. Derravaragh. The lake where this story begins, though the story itself is older than any beginning we might choose. The water moves gently here, even in wind. It laps against the shore with a rhythm that has no urgency, a sound that could lull you if you sat long enough beside it, watching the reeds bend and straighten, as though breathing. The reeds are tall and golden in the autumn light, and they make a sound like whispering when the wind passes through them, a sound that is almost words but not quite, as though the lake itself is trying to tell you something it learned long ago and has been repeating ever since. There are birds here. There have always been birds. In the early morning, before the mist lifts, you can hear them calling to one another across the water, their voices carrying in the stillness. Swans, mostly, white shapes moving slowly through the gray, their necks curved like questions. They do not hurry. Nothing here hurries. Time moves differently beside water, especially old water, water that has been still and deep for longer than human memory can follow. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, just once. The sound hangs in the air and then fades, absorbed by the mist and the water and the quiet. It is the kind of sound that makes you aware of time passing, makes you feel it in your chest like a slow heartbeat. The bell rings from a monastery that does not yet exist in this part of the story, but time is strange here, and sounds carry forward and backward, folding over themselves like water meeting water. This is where Lir lived, Lir, whose name means the sea, though he lived inland beside the lake, in a household that was neither grand nor small, but simply there, rooted in the landscape like an old tree. Lir was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that comes from depth rather than absence. He spoke when speaking mattered, and otherwise let silence hold the space between things. His hands were steady, his step was measured. He moved through the world the way water moves around stone, finding the path of least resistance, shaping slowly, wearing nothing away through force. He had children, 4 of them, and this is where the story truly begins, with the children, though we must approach them slowly, the way you would approach a deer in the forest, careful not to startle, careful to let them come into focus gradually, one detail at a time. The eldest was a girl. She had dark hair that caught the light like a raven's wing, and she moved with a grace that seemed almost accidental, as though she were dancing without realizing it. Her voice was low and warm, and when she spoke, people listened without knowing why, drawn in by something in the cadence, the gentle fall of her words. She was responsible in the way that eldest children often are, carrying a weight she did not resent but bore quietly, naturally, as though it were part of her skeleton, part of the structure that held her upright. The second child was a boy. He was quick where his sister was measured, bright where she was deep. His laughter came easily and filled rooms like sudden light. He asked questions constantly, not to be difficult, but because the world fascinated him, because every answer led to 3 more questions and he could not help but follow them. His hands were always moving, reaching, touching, building something or taking something apart to see how it worked. He was curious the way fire is hungry, naturally, endlessly, without malice. The third child, another boy, was gentler, softer spoken. He noticed things the others missed, the way light fell through leaves, the pattern frost made on a window, the particular song of a thrush versus a blackbird. He could sit still for hours, watching, listening, absorbing the world through his skin. He was the one who found injured creatures and brought them home, who sat with them patiently until they healed or died, accepting both outcomes with equal calm. He understood impermanence in a way the others did not yet. The youngest was a girl,
small and fierce and full of contradiction. She was shy and bold by turns, hiding behind her sister's skirts one moment and climbing trees the next, scraping her knees and laughing. She had a temper that flared quickly and cooled just as fast, leaving no residue, no grudge. She loved fiercely and forgot nothing, holding on to memories with the tenacity of someone who knows, instinctively, that everything changes, that nothing stays, and so each moment must be gripped tightly or it will slip away like water through fingers. These 4 children moved through their father's household like music, not always harmonious, but alive, vibrant, filling the spaces with sound and motion and the particular energy of young things growing. They fought sometimes, the way siblings do, quick storms that passed and left no damage. Mostly they played. They invented games in the long northern summers when the light lasted until nearly midnight, when they could run through the meadows beside the lake until exhaustion took them, and they collapsed in the grass, breathless, staring up at the pale sky, listening to the birds settling for the brief night. They swam in the lake. All 4 of them were strong swimmers, comfortable in the water from an early age. Their father taught them, patient and careful, showing them how to move with the current rather than against it, how to float when they grew tired, how to respect the water's power without fearing it. The lake was cold, even in summer, fed by deep springs that never warmed, but the children did not mind the cold. They dove and surfaced, their laughter echoing across the water, their wet hair plastered to their heads like seal pelts. In winter, when the lake froze at the edges, they skated on the ice, careful not to go too far out where the ice grew thin and dangerous. Their breath made clouds in the cold air, and their cheeks flushed pink, and their fingers grew numb inside their mittens, but they stayed out until their father called them in, until the light failed completely and the stars emerged, sharp and bright in the black sky. Inside the household there was warmth, a fire always burning in the central hearth, the smoke rising to the rafters and escaping through the hole in the roof, the smell of peat and wood smoke, of bread baking, of wet wool drying. The children did their lessons by firelight, learning their letters, their numbers, the old stories that had been passed down through generations. The eldest girl had a gift for languages, picking up new words quickly, savoring them like sweet things. The eldest boy loved mathematics, the certainty of it, the way numbers always behaved according to rules. The younger boy preferred poetry, the sound of words more than their meaning, the rhythm and rhyme. The youngest liked stories best, especially the ones with magic in them, with transformations and curses and impossible tasks. Their mother was gone. This is important to know, though we do not need to dwell on how or when. She had been there, and then she was not, and the household had grown quieter in her absence, not silent, but muted, as though someone had placed a blanket over everything, softening the edges. The children remembered her in fragments, a scent, a particular way of humming, the feel of her hand smoothing hair back from a forehead. These fragments were precious and painful in equal measure, held close and examined in private moments when the grief welled up suddenly, unexpectedly, triggered by something small and ordinary. Lir carried his grief differently. He did not speak of it. He moved through his days with the same steady calm, but there was a heaviness now, a weight that was not there before. He was gentler with the children, more patient, as though he understood that they were all he had left of her, that they carried her forward in their faces, their gestures, their voices. He watched them constantly, not with anxiety, but with attention, memorizing each moment like a squirrel storing nuts for winter, some instinct telling him that nothing lasts, that everything beloved is temporary, that time takes everything eventually. The household had rhythms. Morning began with the household stirring, the fire being built up from embers, water being drawn from the well. The children woke slowly, reluctantly, surfacing from sleep like swimmers coming up for air. They broke their fast together, eating porridge with honey, fresh bread, milk still warm from the cow. They did their chores without much complaint, feeding the animals, mucking out the stable, gathering eggs, hauling water, sweeping, mending. Work was simply part of life, woven through it like thread through cloth, not separate from living, but essential to it. Midday brought lessons or practice. The boys learned to hunt, to track, to use weapons. not for war, but for survival, for the practical necessities of life. The girls learned these things too, but also the domestic arts, not exclusively, not rigidly. Lir believed in capability, in children who could do many things, who would not be helpless regardless of circumstance. So the boys learned to cook and sew, and the girls learned to shoot and ride, and all of them learned to think, to question, to reason, to make decisions.
Afternoons were freer, time for exploration, for play, for pursuing individual interests. The eldest girl liked to ride, taking one of the horses out across the countryside, galloping through the fields with her hair streaming behind her, feeling the power of the animal beneath her, the wind in her face, the sense of freedom that came from speed and space and solitude. The eldest boy liked to build things, constructing elaborate structures from wood and stone, engineering solutions to problems no one had asked him to solve, but which fascinated him nonetheless. The younger boy wandered, often alone, through the forests and along the lakeshore, collecting things, stones, feathers, interesting bits of wood, bringing them home to study, to draw, to incorporate into small, careful sculptures. The youngest followed whoever would let her, wanting to be included, to be part of everything, her energy inexhaustible, her curiosity a constant bright flame. Evenings drew them back together. The household gathered for the evening meal, a more substantial affair than breakfast, with meat or fish, vegetables, bread, sometimes berries or preserved fruit. They ate together, talking about their days, sharing discoveries, debating small points of philosophy or ethics or practical matters. Lir listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his words carried weight, and the children leaned in to hear them. After the meal came the best part of the day, when the work was done and the night stretched ahead full of possibility. Sometimes they played music. Lir had a harp, and the eldest girl had learned to play it, her fingers drawing sounds from the strings that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the instrument itself, as though she were merely revealing music that already existed, waiting to be heard. The eldest boy had a flute, simple but sweet-toned, and he could play by ear, picking up melodies after hearing them once, improvising around them, making them new. The younger children did not play instruments yet, but sang, their voices high and clear, harmonizing instinctively, the way children sometimes can before they learn self-consciousness. Sometimes they told stories. The children took turns, each adding to a tale, building it together, laughing at the unexpected turns, the impossible situations, the creative solutions. Sometimes Lir told the old stories, the ones that had been told for centuries, the myths and legends of their people, tales of gods and heroes, of magic and transformation, of quests and curses and hard-won wisdom. He told these stories in a low, steady voice, and the children listened with rapt attention, even though they had heard many of them before, because a good story bears repeating, and each telling reveals something new, some layer previously hidden. Sometimes they simply sat together in companionable silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts, but together, present to one another, the fire crackling, the wind moving around the house, the night settling like a blanket over the land. These were the moments the youngest child would remember most clearly later, not the grand events or the dramatic changes, but these quiet evenings, the sense of safety and belonging, of being loved without condition, of being home. Winter was the time of deepest intimacy. The days were short and the nights were long, and there was less to do outside, so the household turned inward, drawing close around the fire, the darkness held at bay by light and warmth and proximity. The children grew restless sometimes, cooped up, their energy with nowhere to go, and they bickered more in winter, small irritations magnified by constant contact. But mostly, winter was a time of stories, of music, of handwork done by firelight, of long sleeps and vivid dreams. The children dreamed often and vividly. The eldest girl dreamed of flying, of looking down at the world from above, seeing it spread out like a map, the lake a silver mirror,
the forests dark green patches, the mountains distant and snow-covered. The eldest boy dreamed of understanding everything, of a moment when all knowledge suddenly made sense, fit together perfectly like a puzzle finally completed. The younger boy dreamed in images and sensations rather than narratives, waking with the memory of color and texture and emotion, but no clear sequence of events. The youngest dreamed of her mother, though the dreams were fading, becoming less specific, more feeling than fact, more absence than presence. Lir dreamed too, though he rarely spoke of his dreams. He dreamed of his children grown, safe, happy, living full lives. He dreamed of his wife, conversations they never finished, things he never said. He dreamed sometimes of water, of being underwater, sinking slowly, the light fading above him, but he was not afraid in these dreams, only resigned, accepting, ready. The household existed in a kind of equilibrium, not perfect but balanced, held together by love and routine and the simple fact of being family. This was the world before the sorrow. This was the time when the children were whole and together, when the future stretched ahead unmarked, full of ordinary promise. This was the last season of innocence, though they did not know it, could not know it, because innocence by definition does not know itself, cannot see its own boundaries until after it has crossed them and looked back. The lake held all of this, even then. The water remembered the children's laughter, their swimming, their games along the shore. The reeds remembered the sound of their voices calling to one another. The stones under the water remembered their feet, quick and sure, wading in the shallows. The birds remembered their presence, accepted them as part of the landscape, no more remarkable than the deer that came to drink at dawn or the foxes that hunted at dusk. Everything was preparing, though nothing showed it. The world was about to change, to crack open and reveal something terrible and transformative, but the children played on, unknowing, and their father watched them with love and growing unease, some instinct warning him that happiness is fragile, that peace is temporary, that loss is always waiting, patient as stone, inevitable as winter.
Change came quietly, as it often does. Not with trumpets or warnings, but with a single figure approaching along the road beside the lake, moving at an unhurried pace, traveling light, her shadow long in the afternoon sun. A woman alone, which was unusual but not unheard of, especially if she was noble or had protection, some guarantee of safety that went unspoken but understood. Her name was Aoife. The children heard it first from the servants, whispered in the hallways, spoken with a complicated mixture of curiosity and caution. She was coming to stay. She was family, though distantly, connected through marriage and blood in ways the children did not fully understand and did not particularly care about. What mattered was that someone new was arriving, breaking the routine, introducing uncertainty into their settled world. They watched from the windows as she approached, her figure gradually resolving from a distant shape into a woman, tall and straight-backed, moving with a contained grace that suggested discipline, control, and awareness of herself in space. She rode a gray horse that stepped carefully, precisely, as though it had been trained to move without disturbing the air around it. She wore dark colors, practical traveling clothes, her hair braided and pinned, her face calm and unrevealing. Lir went out to greet her. The children heard this too, pressed against the windows, the eldest girl hushing the youngest when she started to ask questions. They saw their father bow slightly, saw Aoife dismount, saw them speak, though no words reached the children through the thick walls. Then Lir gestured toward the house, and Aoife followed him inside, leading her horse, and the children scattered, not wanting to be caught watching, moving to more appropriate positions, pretending to be engaged in their usual activities. She entered the hall, and the room seemed to darken slightly, or perhaps that was imagination, the children's collective unconscious responding to something they could not name.
Aoife was beautiful in a way that was hard to describe, her features regular and fine, her eyes dark and deep-set, her mouth full but serious. She did not smile when she was introduced to the children, but she inclined her head to each in turn, acknowledging them with grave courtesy. The eldest girl curtsied, perfect and practiced. The eldest boy bowed, formal and correct. The younger boy ducked his head, shy suddenly, overwhelmed by this stranger's intensity. The youngest stared openly, forgetting her manners, until her sister pinched her arm gently, and she remembered to curtsy, though clumsily, her face flushing. Aoife spoke to them briefly, her voice low and pleasant, unremarkable. She asked polite questions about their lessons, their interests, their ages. They answered politely, but briefly, uncertain what to make of her, waiting for some clue about who she was and why she had come and how long she would stay. No such clues came. After a few minutes, Lir suggested the children return to their activities, and they fled gratefully, leaving the adults to their incomprehensible conversations. In the days that followed, Aoife settled into the household the way water seeps into sand, gradually, thoroughly, until she was simply there, part of the landscape. She had her own chambers, she took her meals with the family. She moved through the house with quiet confidence, learning its rhythms, adapting to its patterns. She was courteous to the servants, neither warm nor cold, simply correct. She was respectful to Lir, deferential without being subservient, and to the children she was watchful. They felt her watching constantly, not obviously, not in a way they could point to or complain about, but a sense of being observed, evaluated, measured against some standard they could not see. When they played, they felt her eyes on them. When they studied, they sensed her presence nearby, listening. When they spoke at meals, they felt her attention sharpen, focus, assess. It made them self-conscious. The eldest girl found herself moving more carefully, speaking more precisely, aware that every gesture might be judged. The eldest boy grew quieter, his usual exuberance dampened, his questions fewer and more carefully considered. The younger boy withdrew further into himself, spending more time alone, avoiding common spaces where he might encounter Aoife's silent observation. The youngest tried at first to win Aoife's approval, performing small kindnesses, offering gifts, seeking attention, but Aoife's response was always the same, polite acknowledgement, nothing more, no warmth, no reciprocation, just a cool acceptance that left the child feeling foolish and rejected. Lir seemed not to notice, or if he noticed, he said nothing. His relationship with Aoife was formal, proper, maintaining appropriate distance. They did not laugh together, they did not share confidences, they simply coexisted, two adults managing a household, coordinating practical matters, nothing more. The children wondered sometimes if their father was lonely, if he minded the absence of warmth between himself and Aoife, but they could not read his face, could not penetrate his customary calm. Winter deepened. The days grew shorter, the cold more intense. Ice formed thickly on the lake, and snow fell in heavy blankets, muffling sound, transforming the landscape into something unfamiliar and vaguely threatening. The household turned inward even more completely, and Aoife's presence felt more oppressive in the confined space, her silence louder somehow in the close quarters. She did not tell stories, she did not play music. When the children sang or played in the evenings, she sat apart, hands folded, face expressionless, neither approving nor disapproving, simply present, a dark figure in the corner of their awareness, a weight that could not be ignored. The children began to notice changes in their father, subtle things. He was distracted, often staring into the fire for long periods, his mind elsewhere. He spoke less, even to them. His smiles, when they came, seemed effortful, as though he were lifting something heavy. He looked tired, older somehow, as though the winter were wearing on him more than usual. The eldest girl tried to talk to him once, catching him alone in the stables, but he deflected her concerns gently, insisting everything was fine. He was simply preoccupied with estate matters, nothing for her to worry about. She did not believe him, but did not push. She had learned that adults kept their troubles to themselves, shared them only with other adults, and children were expected to accept reassurances, even when those reassurances rang hollow.
Aoife's jealousy, if that is what it was, remained hidden. She gave no outward sign of resentment or anger. She did not speak harshly to the children or mistreat them in any way, but there was something in the quality of her attention, the intensity of her watching, that spoke of hunger, of wanting, of some deep dissatisfaction that could not be named or addressed. She watched Lir with the children, saw how he softened around them, how his face opened when they laughed, how gently he touched their heads, their shoulders, offering casual affection. She watched the children themselves, saw their closeness, the way they moved around each other with easy familiarity, finishing each other's sentences, sharing private jokes, existing in a world of intimacy from which she was excluded. Perhaps she had wanted to be part of that world. Perhaps she had come to the household hoping to be welcomed into that circle of warmth and belonging. Perhaps she had expected that affection would be extended to her automatically, that she would be folded into the family simply by virtue of being there. When this did not happen, when the children remained polite but distant, and Lir remained courteous but cool, perhaps something in her hardened, curdled, turned sour. Or perhaps the jealousy was there from the beginning, brought with her like baggage, a poison she had been carrying for years, waiting only for the right circumstances to release it. Perhaps she had always resented happiness that was not her own, warmth in which she could not share, love that flowed freely to others while she remained untouched, unwanted, alone in the midst of plenty. The children could not have understood this even if they had known it. They were too young, too innocent still, despite the loss of their mother, despite the small griefs that had already touched their lives. They understood jealousy in its simple forms, wanting a toy another child had, resenting a sibling who got more attention, but not this deeper, more complex hunger, the kind that grows in the dark places of the heart and feeds on itself, becoming monstrous. Winter reached its darkest point, the solstice, the longest night. The household observed it quietly, lighting extra candles, keeping the fire blazing, marking the moment when the year turned and the light began, however slowly, to return. The children stayed up late, allowed this once to witness the midnight, to see the old year end and the new one begin. They sat together near the fire, drowsy and warm, while outside the wind howled and the snow fell and the darkness pressed against the windows like something alive, something hungry. Aoife sat apart, as always, her face illuminated by firelight, shadows pooling in the hollows beneath her eyes, her cheekbones, the corners of her mouth. She looked older in the firelight, harder, as though the flickering flames revealed some truth usually hidden in steady daylight. The children avoided looking at her directly, some instinct warning them away, but they felt her presence, constant and cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. The year turned, light began its slow return, but the household did not lighten with it. Something had changed, though the children could not have said what. The air felt heavier, conversations felt strained, silences stretched uncomfortably. Lir grew more withdrawn, and Aoife more present, her watchfulness intensifying, her silence becoming almost aggressive in its weight. The eldest girl began having dreams, not the pleasant flying dreams of before, but darker ones, filled with loss and searching, with calling for someone who could not hear, with being unable to move or speak when danger approached. She woke from these dreams with her heart racing, her sheets tangled, sweat cooling on her skin despite the cold.
She did not mention the dreams to anyone, but she grew quieter during the days, more serious, as though she were preparing for something, bracing herself against some approaching storm. The eldest boy's curiosity dimmed. He stopped asking questions, stopped building his elaborate structures, stopped approaching the world with his usual enthusiasm. He moved through his days mechanically, doing what was required but nothing more, his brightness banked like a fire covered with ashes, still hot beneath but giving no light. The younger boy spent more and more time alone, wandering even in the cold, preferring the sharp, clean pain of winter wind to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. He brought home no more treasures, built no more sculptures. He seemed to be waiting, watching like an animal that senses an earthquake before it strikes, alert to vibrations the others could not feel. The youngest child's fierce brightness faltered. She grew clingy, following her siblings constantly, afraid to be alone, afraid to be separated from them even for short periods. She had nightmares and crawled into her sister's bed in the dark hours before dawn, pressing close, seeking comfort and reassurance that her sister gave automatically, but with increasing worry because she did not know what was wrong, could not name the thing that was frightening her little sister, could not protect against a threat that had no shape or form. Spring came late that year, reluctant, as though the land itself were hesitant to release winter's grip. The snow melted slowly, revealing dead grass and bare earth, the landscape brown and bleak, waiting for green to return. The ice on the lake began to break up, great sheets of it grinding against each other, groaning like living things in pain. The children listened to these sounds at night, lying in their beds, and felt their unease deepen, as though the lake itself were warning them, trying to tell them something in a language they had not yet learned to understand. Aoife proposed an excursion. It was a bright morning in early spring, the sun finally showing some warmth, the air smelling of thaw and new growth. She suggested a journey to the lake, a picnic perhaps, a chance to shake off the long winter's confinement and enjoy the returning season. Lir agreed readily, pleased to see any initiative from Aoife, any engagement with the children. He helped prepare, packing food, arranging for horses, planning the route. The children felt a clutching in their chests when they heard the plan, a warning they could not explain or justify. They looked at each other with wide eyes, each seeing their own fear reflected, but they said nothing. How could they? What would they say? That they were afraid of nothing, of everything, of a feeling they could not name? That they did not trust Aoife, though she had done nothing overtly wrong? Children's fears are often dismissed, especially when they cannot be articulated clearly, when they sound like imagination or fancy rather than legitimate concern. So they said nothing. They prepared for the journey with slow hands and heavy hearts, some deep part of them knowing that everything was about to change, that the world they had known was ending, that what came next would break them in ways they could not survive intact. They gathered their warmest cloaks, their sturdiest shoes. They ate their breakfast without appetite. They mounted their horses with leaden limbs, and they followed Aoife away from the household, along the road beside the lake, into a morning that should have been beautiful, but felt only ominous, heavy with fate.
The journey to the lake took them along familiar paths, roads the children had traveled countless times before. Yet everything looked different this morning, strange and slightly wrong, as though they were seeing the landscape through warped glass. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches reaching like fingers. The sky, though blue and clear, felt oppressive, a lid pressed down over the world. Even the horses moved uneasily, tossing their heads, stepping sideways occasionally, sensing something amiss though they could not have said what. Aoife led the way, straight-backed and purposeful, never looking back to see if the children followed. They followed anyway, pulled forward by a momentum they could not resist, like stones rolling downhill. Lir had not come with them. He had business at the household, matters requiring his attention, and had sent them off with a distracted wave,
his mind already elsewhere. The children had looked back at the house as they rode away, memorizing it somehow, storing the image as though they might never see it again, though this thought did not surface consciously, remained buried beneath their gathering dread. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher but gave little warmth. The road wound through forest and field, past scattered farms, past ancient standing stones that marked boundaries no one remembered, past wells and shrines and all the small sacred places that dotted the landscape. They passed other travelers occasionally, people who nodded greeting and moved on, noticing nothing unusual, seeing only a woman and 4 children on a morning ride, ordinary and unremarkable. They reached the lake by midday, not Lake Derravaragh where they lived, but another lake, smaller and more remote, surrounded by hills that rose steeply on 3 sides, creating a natural amphitheater. The water here was very still, mirror smooth, reflecting the sky so perfectly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. There was no wind, no birds sang. The silence was complete, total, pressing against their ears like water pressure, making them aware of their own heartbeats, their own breathing, the small sounds of their existence. Aoife dismounted. The children dismounted as well, moving slowly, reluctantly, every instinct screaming at them to flee, to run, to mount their horses and gallop away as fast as the animals could carry them. But they were children, and she was an adult, and they had been taught obedience, respect for their elders, so they stood where they were, waiting, watching, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. Aoife walked to the water's edge. The children followed, keeping their distance, clustering together instinctively, seeking comfort in proximity. The youngest held her sister's hand so tightly it hurt, but the eldest did not pull away, understood the need, shared it. The boys stood on either side of their sisters, forming a protective circle, though what they were protecting against they could not have said. The lake stretched before them, perfectly still, the water so clear they could see the bottom near the shore, could see the smooth stones lying there, could see the way light filtered down through the water in wavering columns. Deeper out, the water darkened, becoming opaque, impenetrable, hiding whatever depths might lie beneath. The surface reflected everything: sky, clouds, the ring of hills, the small figures of the children and Aoife standing at the edge, tiny and vulnerable against the vastness. Aoife spoke for the first time since leaving the household. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which made what she said more terrible somehow. She told them to remove their shoes, their cloaks. She told them to wade into the water. Just to the shallows, she said, just to cool their feet after the ride. The children did not move. They stared at her, at the water, back at her, understanding finally that the moment had come, that whatever they had been dreading was here now, immediate and inescapable.
The eldest girl found her voice. She asked why. Simple question. 3 letters. Infinite weight. Aoife did not answer. She repeated her instruction, and there was something in her voice now, a hardness, an edge, that made it clear this was not a request, but a command, and refusal would have consequences they did not want to explore. So the children obeyed, moving like sleepwalkers, their hands trembling as they unfastened their cloaks, slipped off their shoes, stood barefoot on the cold earth. The youngest was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, her small body shaking. Her sister held her hand tighter, whispered that it would be all right, though both of them knew this was a lie, knew that nothing would be all right ever again. The boys said nothing, their faces white, their jaws clenched, trying to be brave, trying to protect their sisters even though they did not know how, did not understand what was happening or how to stop it. Aoife gestured toward the water. The children stepped forward, their feet touching the lake, the cold shocking even though they had expected it, even though they had swum in cold water before. This cold was different, deeper, bone deep, soul deep,
A cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with what was coming. The transformation waiting just beneath the surface, already reaching for them with invisible hands. They waded in further, the water rising to their ankles, their calves, their knees. The lake bottom was smooth beneath their feet, no sharp stones, nothing to hurt them physically. The water was so clear they could see their legs distorted by refraction, looking bent and strange, already not quite belonging to them. They stopped when the water reached their thighs, could not make themselves go deeper, stood frozen, waiting. Aoife began to speak again, and this time her words were not in their language, not in any language they knew. The sounds were harsh and ancient, angular, cutting through the silence like a knife through cloth. She spoke rhythmically, a chant or incantation, and as she spoke, the air seemed to thicken, to vibrate, to become almost visible, shimmering like heat waves over summer stones. The children felt it first as a tingling in their feet, where they touched the water. A strange sensation, not quite pain, not quite pleasure, something other, something wrong. The tingling spread upward through their legs, their torsos, their arms, their necks, their heads, until their entire bodies buzzed with it, hummed with it, trembled with it. They tried to move, to run, but found they could not, found their bodies unresponsive, frozen in place by the spell Aoife wove around them with her terrible ancient words. The transformation began. It did not hurt, which was somehow worse than if it had. Pain they could have understood, could have fought against, could have used to anchor themselves to what they were. But this was painless, this gentle dissolution of self, this slow rewriting of flesh and bone and blood into something other. They felt their bones hollowing, becoming light and delicate. They felt their skin roughening, hardening, white covering spreading where skin had been. They felt their arms lengthening, changing, fingers fusing, feathers emerging from flesh that was no longer quite flesh. The eldest girl watched her hands transform, saw her fingers merge and flatten and sprout white feathers, saw her arms become wings, elegant and powerful, stretching wider than she was tall. She tried to scream, but the sound that emerged was not human, was a swan's cry, wild and haunting and full of grief. Her siblings were changing beside her. She could see them transforming, could see the horror in their eyes even as those eyes changed color, darkened, became the black eyes of swans, beautiful and alien and wrong. The eldest boy felt his neck elongating, stretching, becoming graceful and curved, a swan's neck, beautiful and terrible. He felt his face pushing forward, reshaping, his mouth hardening into a beak, his nose disappearing, his features erasing themselves, all the small details that had made him himself vanishing as though they had never been. He wanted to reach for his siblings, to hold them, to comfort them, but his arms were wings now, covered in white feathers, and he could only cry out, that strange, harsh swan cry, trying to convey love and terror in a voice that was no longer his.
The younger boy felt the change most keenly in his heart, felt something essential shifting, felt his human self compressing, condensing, being pushed down into some deep interior space, while something else rose to take its place, something older, more primal, the consciousness of the swan overlaying his human mind like a second skin. He fought it, tried to hold on to who he was, tried to remember his name, his father, his home, but the memories were slipping away like water through fingers, and he was terrified he would lose himself completely, would become entirely swan and forget he had ever been a boy. The youngest felt herself shrinking, her small body becoming smaller still, a young swan, a cygnet, though fully formed, fully feathered. She felt the cold water differently now, felt it through waterproof feathers instead of skin, felt her body wanting to float, to swim, to surrender to the water and let it hold her.
She fought against this instinct, clung to her human thoughts, to the memory of her sister's hand holding hers, to the love she felt for her family, using these things as anchors against the tide of swanness that threatened to sweep her human self away entirely. And then it was done. 4 swans floated where 4 children had stood, white against the dark water, heartbreakingly beautiful, their long necks curved in attitudes of despair, their black eyes full of human intelligence and human suffering. They looked at each other and saw what they had become, saw their siblings transformed, and the grief was overwhelming, crushing, a weight that should have drowned them but somehow did not. Somehow they continued to float, to breathe, to exist in this new, terrible form. Aoife spoke again, and this time they understood her. Somehow the spell granted them that much, the ability to comprehend even if they could not respond in human speech. She told them the terms of the curse, her voice matter-of-fact, businesslike, as though she were explaining a recipe or giving directions to a destination. 900 years, she said, 300 years on each of 3 lakes, 300 years here on Lake Derravaragh, where they had lived as humans, 300 years on the Sea of Moyle, the narrow strait between Ireland and Scotland, cold and storm-tossed and cruel. 300 years on Innis Glora, a small lake in the far north, remote and desolate where no human lived. 900 years. The children's human minds reeled at the number, could not comprehend it, could not hold the weight of all that time. 900 years, longer than any human life, longer than any kingdom, longer than memory. 900 years during which they would remain swans, trapped in these beautiful forms, unable to speak, unable to touch, unable to return home. Only one thing could break the curse, Aoife said, and her voice held a note of satisfaction, of triumph, as though she had planned this carefully, thought through every detail. The curse would break when a northern man married a southern woman and when the bell of a new god rang across the waters. So specific, so unlikely, so distant that it might as well have been never. The children understood they were being sentenced to eternity, or something close enough to it that the difference did not matter. Aoife finished speaking. She stood for a moment longer, looking at the swans, her face unreadable. Did she feel triumph, satisfaction, regret? The swans could not tell, could not read human expressions with their swan eyes, could not understand the complexity of emotions that might have moved across Aoife's face. Then she turned and walked back to her horse, mounted smoothly, and rode away without looking back, leaving the 4 swans floating in the still water, alone with their transformation and their impossible sentence. The swans did not move for a long time. They floated in the shallows, too shocked to swim, too devastated to do anything but exist, breathing in and out, feeling the strange new sensations of their swan bodies, the water supporting them effortlessly, the air moving through their feathers, their hearts beating fast and light, their vision sharp and strange, seeing colors differently, seeing the world from a lower perspective, everything transformed. Gradually, they began to move, small movements at first, paddling with their webbed feet, feeling how their bodies responded, learning the mechanics of being swans. It came naturally, instinctively, their bodies knowing what to do even though their minds had no memory of ever being anything but human. They swam slowly, staying close together, needing the proximity, needing to see their siblings, to confirm that they were all still there, still together even in this changed form. They discovered they could still think, still reason, still remember who they had been. This was both mercy and curse. Mercy because they retained their humanity, their identities, their love for each other. Curse because they could not forget, could not simply become swans and be content with swan concerns. They were trapped between two worlds, fully neither human nor swan, but some terrible hybrid, condemned to live as animals while thinking as humans, aware of everything they had lost, everything they could no longer be or do. Night fell, the sun setting behind the hills, painting the sky in colors the swans saw differently now, more vividly, more intensely, their swan eyes registering wavelengths their human eyes had missed. They huddled together in the shallows, their necks intertwined, their bodies pressed close, seeking comfort in touch since speech was denied them. They made soft sounds, small whistles and honks, trying to communicate, trying to tell each other that they were still there, still themselves, still family despite the transformation. The stars emerged, bright and cold, indifferent to the suffering below. The water lapped gently at the shore, the same sound it had made for centuries, would make for centuries more, enduring, while humans and swans and kingdoms rose and fell and were forgotten. The swans watched the stars and felt time begin its slow, terrible work, felt the first night of 900 years settle over them like a weight they would carry until the curse broke or they broke beneath it, whichever came first.
The first morning came slowly, light creeping across the water in gradual degrees, the darkness thinning rather than breaking, the world emerging from night like something rising from deep water. The swans had not slept, could not sleep, their minds too active, too shocked, too overwhelmed by the enormity of what had happened. They had spent the night huddled together, shivering despite their insulating feathers, shivering from grief rather than cold, from the psychological shock of transformation, from the knowledge of all the centuries stretching ahead of them. As light grew, they began to see their new world more clearly. The lake looked different from this low perspective, vast and intimidating, the far shore distant and unreachable, even though they had walked around this lake many times as children. Everything was larger now, more immediate, more dangerous. A fish breaking the surface nearby made them startle violently, their swan bodies responding with instant animal panic before their human minds could reassert control, remind them there was no threat, just a fish, just an ordinary morning. They needed to eat, but did not know how, did not know what swans ate or where to find it. Their bodies knew, though, instinct guiding them without conscious thought. They found themselves dipping their heads underwater, reaching down with their long necks to grab vegetation from the lake bottom, pulling up long strands of waterweed and consuming it mechanically, their bodies needing fuel even though their minds had no appetite, could not imagine eating, could not imagine anything ordinary or normal ever again. The food tasted strange, not unpleasant but wrong, nothing like human food, texture and flavor completely different, their swan taste buds responding to things their human taste buds would have ignored. They ate because their bodies demanded it, because hunger was a physical reality that could not be denied, even in the midst of psychological catastrophe. They ate and felt their strength returning slightly, felt their bodies accepting this new reality, even as their minds continued to reject it. They learned to swim properly, not the tentative paddling of the previous day, but true swimming, their bodies slicing through the water with surprising speed and grace. It felt good, which disturbed them, this small pleasure in physical movement, as though their bodies were betraying them, adapting too readily, accepting the transformation too easily. They resented the grace, resented the beauty of their swan forms, wanted to be clumsy and ugly, wanted their outsides to match the destruction they felt inside. Days passed, blurring together. They learned the rhythms of swan life, when to feed, when to rest,
how to preen their feathers with their beaks, extracting the oil from a gland near their tails and spreading it across their feathers to waterproof them. The actions came automatically, their bodies performing complex tasks their human minds had never learned, muscle memory written into their very bones by the transformation spell, by the essential swanness now woven through their being. They discovered they could still communicate after a fashion, not with words, but with sounds, with gestures, with the angle of a neck or the position of wings. They developed a language of small signs, building a vocabulary of meaning from the limited tools available to them. A particular whistle meant danger. A certain head movement meant comfort, reassurance. A specific wing position meant follow me, stay close, I'm here. It was crude compared to human speech, frustratingly limited, but it was something, a way to maintain connection, to continue being family despite the transformation.
The lake became their entire world, and they learned it intimately. Every inlet and outlet, every shallow and deep place, every rock and reed bed. They learned where the fish spawned, where the best waterweed grew, where to shelter when storms came. They learned the other inhabitants of the lake, the ordinary swans who did not speak or think, who lived simple swan lives, concerned only with food and territory and mating. These swans were both like them and utterly unlike them, and the four cursed swans felt their strangeness keenly, felt themselves not quite swan, not quite human, belonging nowhere. Weeks became months, seasons changed. Spring deepened into summer, the water warming, the shore blooming with wildflowers, the air full of insect song and bird calls, and all the busy noise of life renewing itself. The swans watched the world continue without them, watched human fishermen come to the lake, watched children playing on the shores, watched life proceeding normally while their own lives remained frozen in this terrible between state. They wondered if anyone was looking for them, if their father had searched, if the household had sent out riders to scour the countryside for 4 missing children. They wondered if Aoife had told some convincing lie, explained their absence with a story believable enough to stop the search. They wondered if anyone grieved for them, or if the world had simply moved on, filled the gap they left with other concerns, other loves, other tragedies. One morning, they saw a figure on the shore they recognized, a shape that made their hearts, their swan hearts, beat faster with hope and grief combined. Lir, their father, standing at the water's edge, staring out across the lake with an expression of such profound loss it was visible even at a distance, even to swan eyes that could not read human faces well. He stood utterly still, a statue carved from grief, and the swans swam toward him without conscious decision, pulled by love, by need, by the desperate hope that somehow he would recognize them, would know them despite their transformation. They approached the shore where he stood, swam into the shallows, close enough to see his face clearly, close enough to see the tears tracking down his cheeks, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the trembling in his shoulders as he fought for composure. He looked at them, and for a moment, a single suspended moment, they thought he knew, thought recognition flared in his eyes, thought he would speak their names and somehow break the curse through the sheer force of paternal love. But he did not. He saw only swans, beautiful and graceful, but only swans. His eyes moved over them without seeing, without recognizing, and the hope that had flared in the children's hearts died slowly, painfully, leaving ashes. They made sounds, desperate sounds, trying to communicate, trying to convey who they were, but to Lir they were only swan sounds, meaningless, animal, nothing to do with his lost children. He stayed for a long time, standing at the water's edge, staring out across the lake, as though searching for something he could not find, as though the water might yield some answer to his grief if he only looked hard enough. The swans stayed too, floating nearby, watching him, memorizing him,
storing every detail because they did not know if they would see him again, did not know how long he would live, how many years they would have to endure alone after he was gone. Eventually, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy, his shoulders bowed, a man carrying a weight too great to bear, but bearing it anyway, because life continues even after the worst has happened, even after everything beloved has been lost. The swans watched him go, watched until he disappeared into the trees, watched until the space where he had been was empty, just shore and grass and wind, nothing to show he had been there except the marks his boots had left in the mud. They grieved then, properly, completely, the grief they had been holding back since the transformation finally overwhelming them. They cried without tears, because swans cannot weep, made sounds that were not human but conveyed human suffering, their voices harsh and broken and full of a sorrow that had no bottom, no limit, no end. They grieved for their father's grief, for his not knowing, for the fact that they could see him but could not comfort him, could not tell him they still existed, still loved him, still thought of themselves as his children, even trapped in these animal forms. The grief exhausted them, left them hollow and numb, floating listlessly on the water, uncaring whether they lived or died, uncaring about anything except the terrible fact of their continued existence, the cruel joke of consciousness preserved inside bodies that could not speak, could not act, could not bridge the gap between what they were and what they had been. But life, animal life, does not permit despair for long. Hunger returned, thirst, the need to move, to feed, to continue. Their bodies asserted themselves, demanded attention, and the swans found themselves swimming, eating, preening, going through the motions of survival, even though their hearts were broken, even though survival felt like a punishment rather than gift. Time passed. Lir came to the lake again, irregularly, unpredictably, sometimes after weeks, sometimes after months. Each time the swans swam to shore, each time they tried to communicate, each time they failed, and each time they watched him leave, his grief undiminished by time, his hope of finding his children dying by slow degrees, but never quite extinguishing completely. They watched him age, saw the gray creeping into his hair, the lines deepening in his face, the way his movements became stiffer, slower, the weight of years and sorrow bending him gradually toward the earth.
Seasons cycled. Winter came and the lake froze at the edges, and the swans learned what swans do in winter, how to break through thin ice to reach water, how to huddle together for warmth during the coldest nights, how to survive when food grew scarce and the world turned white and harsh and unforgiving. They learned spring's return, the ice breaking up, the water warming, life surging back, and how this renewal felt cruel when you could not renew yourself, when you were locked in the same form, the same curse, year after year with no change, no progress, no hope. They learned summer's plenty, the lake teeming with life, the shores green and lush, and how abundance meant nothing when you could not share it with those you loved, when your father stood on the shore and did not know you, when your home was visible across the water but unreachable, transformed into foreign territory from which you were permanently exiled. They learned autumn's melancholy, the leaves turning, the birds migrating, the world preparing for another winter, and how that cyclical nature became oppressive when you could not escape it, when you had to endure it not once or twice or 10 times, but hundreds of times, season after season after season, stretching ahead until the mind could not conceive of the end, until 300 years became not a number, but a sentence, a life sentence, a death sentence, both and neither. Stories circulated among the humans who lived near the lake, tales of 4 magical swans who seemed almost human, who swam together always, who sang with voices that sounded almost like speech,
who watched humans with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand, to remember. The stories varied in their details, but shared a common thread of mystery, of magic, of something uncanny about these particular swans. Some people sought them out, came to the lake hoping to see the famous swans, and the swans learned to hide during these times, diving beneath the surface, swimming to remote corners of the lake where humans rarely ventured, wanting no part of fame or story, wanting only to be left alone with their grief and their memories. Children came sometimes, the sight of whom was almost unbearable to the swan children, seeing what they themselves had been, what they could never be again. They watched human children play on the shores, watched them laugh and fight and make up, watched them learn to swim, to skip stones, to climb trees, all the ordinary activities of childhood. And the watching was torture, a reminder of everything lost, everything stolen, everything that would never return no matter how many centuries passed. Years became decades, decades became a century, then 2 centuries, then 3. The passage of time lost its meaning after a certain point, the years blending together, indistinguishable, one long stretch of sameness, broken only by the cycling seasons, the aging and death of their father, the slow changes in the landscape as humans built and abandoned settlements, as forests grew and were cut down, as the lake itself shifted slightly, changing shape in response to floods and droughts, and the slow geological processes that work on scales too large for individual lives to perceive, but visible across centuries. Lir died. They did not see it happen, but they felt it. Some deep instinctual knowing that he was gone, that the world had lost his presence, that they were truly orphaned now, truly alone in a way they had not been before. They mourned him from a distance, unable to attend whatever funeral was held, unable to say goodbye, unable to tell him they had loved him, still loved him, would always love him, even after death separated them as completely as the curse had. His death released something in them, some last thread of connection to their old lives, and they found themselves strangely free and strangely unmoored, adrift in time with no anchor, no reference point, nothing to hold them to the world they had known. They might have despaired completely then, might have stopped eating, stopped trying, stopped living, but they had each other, and that made all the difference. That kept them afloat when everything else tried to pull them under.
They developed routines that had nothing to do with being swans and everything to do with staying human inside, preserving their identities against the erosive force of time. Each evening, as the sun set, they gathered in a specific inlet on the lake's western shore, and they sang. Not swan sounds, but human songs. Melodies their mother had sung to them, songs they had learned as children, songs that preserved some small piece of who they had been. The songs came out wrong through their swan throats, distorted and strange, but the melodies were recognizable, and singing them together was an act of defiance, a refusal to surrender completely to the transformation, a way of saying we are still human, we remember, we have not forgotten who we were. They told stories, too, in their limited way, using their small vocabulary of sounds and gestures to share memories, to revisit their childhood, to keep those memories alive and present rather than letting them fade into the distant past. The eldest girl told about learning to ride, about the first time she galloped across the fields alone, about the feeling of freedom and power and joy. The eldest boy told about building his most elaborate structure, about the pride he felt when it stood complete, about the satisfaction of solving problems through cleverness and persistence. The younger boy told about finding a wounded bird and nursing it back to health, about the moment it flew away recovered, about understanding that love sometimes means letting go. The youngest told about her mother, the fragments she remembered, the feeling of safety she associated with her mother's presence,
the loss that had never quite healed even before the curse compounded it with so much more loss. These stories, these songs, these small acts of remembrance kept them human through the centuries, gave them purpose beyond mere survival, reminded them that they were not just swans, but people, still people, always people, regardless of their outer form. The routine became sacred, inviolable, something they never missed, even during the harshest weather, even when exhausted or ill, even when continuing seemed pointless because the centuries stretched ahead endlessly and nothing they did would shorten them or make them easier to bear. Other swans came and went, living their brief swan lives, a few decades at most, then dying and being replaced by new swans who knew nothing of the four strange ones who sang at sunset, who clustered together always, who never mated or built nests or participated in normal swan society. The cursed swans watched generations of ordinary swans live and die, watched countless cycles of birth and growth and decline and death, and felt the cruel mathematics of their curse keenly, understanding that they would outlive hundreds of these brief lives, would see entire populations turn over again and again while they remained unchanged, locked in the same moment, the same suspended state between life and death, between human and animal, between past and future, with no present that belonged to them. The landscape changed around them in ways both subtle and dramatic. Trees that had been saplings when they were transformed grew into giants, then fell and rotted and were replaced by new growth. The lake's shores shifted as water levels rose and fell. Human settlements appeared, prospered, declined, disappeared, leaving only faint traces that the swans recognized, but that meant nothing to the new humans who came after, who saw only ruins, only old stones, only evidence of previous habitation without understanding the stories those stones could tell. Magic faded from the world, or went underground, or changed into something different. The old gods were forgotten, replaced by new gods, new stories, new ways of understanding the sacred and the supernatural. Christianity arrived, spreading slowly across the land, bringing bells and monks and a new cosmology that had no place for shape-shifting or curses or the old wild magic that had once been as common as rain. The swans felt this change, felt something draining from the world, some vitality or strangeness or possibility, and they wondered if this was part of the curse's calculation, if Aoife had foreseen this transformation of the world itself, had designed their punishment to last exactly until the old world ended and a new one began. They endured. That was all they could do, all they were required to do. Endure the cold of winter and the heat of summer. Endure hunger when food was scarce and fullness when it was plentiful. Endure loneliness even in each other's company, because no matter how close they were, they could never truly communicate, never fully share their inner lives, never bridge the gap between individual consciousness and connection. Endure boredom, the terrible, crushing boredom of centuries, the same lake, the same shore, the same routine day after day after day, until the days lost all distinction and became one endless day, one eternal present moment stretching forward and backward simultaneously. They endured because they had no choice. They endured because they loved each other and could not bear to abandon their siblings even through death, even though death might have been release, might have been mercy. They endured because some stubborn core of humanity remained intact inside them, some essential piece of self that refused to quit, refused to surrender, refused to let the curse win completely, even though it had already won in every way that mattered. And somehow, impossibly, the 300 years passed. Not quickly, not easily, but they passed. Year by glacial year, decade by agonizing decade, century by crushing century, until finally one morning they felt a change, a shift, some fundamental alteration in the magical bonds that held them. The first phase of the curse had ended. It was time to move to the second lake, to begin the second exile, to leave the only home they had known, even in swan form, and journey to a place they had heard of but never seen, a place that featured in their nightmares, a place whose very name meant suffering. The Sea of Moyle.
The journey north began at dawn, the 4 swans lifting from Lake Derravaragh's surface with heavy wing beats, their bodies strong after 3 centuries of swimming and flying, their spirits heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. They had never flown far before, had stayed near the lake always, bound to it by the terms of the curse and by their own reluctance to venture away from the last place that held any connection to their human lives. Now the curse compelled them forward, pulled them north with an invisible force they could not resist, would not resist, because to stay meant worse suffering than to go. They flew high, higher than they had known swans could fly, and from this height they saw the land spread out below them like a map, like memory, patchwork fields and dark forests, rivers threading silver through green, mountains rising in the distance, everything miniature and perfect and remote. They saw their fathers' lands, the household where they had been children, though it looked different now, smaller, altered by time and human hands. They circled once, a farewell to what had been, then turned north and did not look back. The flight took days, though they could have made it faster if they had pushed, if they had not needed to rest, to eat, to recover their strength between stages. They flew over territory they had never seen as children, places they had only heard about in stories, and the world revealed itself as vast and various and full of change. They passed over other lakes, each one a small blue eye staring up at them. They passed over the sea on their eastern side, its gray expanse stretching to the horizon and beyond, to lands they had never seen and would never know. They passed over human settlements, small villages clustered around churches, larger towns with walls and markets, and once, in the distance, what might have been a city, though the swans did not know its name, did not know anything except that humans continued to build and live and die, and that life went on without them, had gone on without them for 300 years, and would go on without them for 600 more. As they flew north, the landscape changed, the air grew colder, the green faded, replaced by gray and brown, by stone and scrubland, by terrain that looked harsher, less forgiving, less interested in human habitation. They passed over mountains whose peaks were still snow-covered despite the season, and the wind that blew off those peaks was bitter, cutting through their feathers, making flight difficult, forcing them to work harder for every mile. And then they saw it, ahead of them, the narrow strait between Ireland and Scotland that was called the Sea of Moyle, and their hearts, their swan hearts, sank at the sight. It was gray and angry, the water churning with currents and countercurrents, waves breaking white over rocks that protruded like black teeth, the whole expanse radiating hostility, promising suffering, delivering on the curse's intent to break them if 300 quiet years on a peaceful lake had not already succeeded. They descended reluctantly, spiraling down toward the cold water, the wind buffeting them, making landing difficult. They hit the surface hard, less gracefully than they would have liked, and the water was shockingly cold even to their cold-adapted bodies, cold in a way that Lake Derravaragh had never been, cold that cut through feathers and skin and seemed to reach directly into bone, into marrow, into the core of their being where warmth should reside, but found only more cold. The water tasted of salt, foreign on their tongues, their systems not designed for salt water, but adapting quickly, magically, the curse ensuring they would survive this exile, even if they could not be comfortable, even if every moment would be difficult, every day a struggle. They huddled together immediately, instinctively, needing the warmth of each other's bodies, the comfort of proximity, the assurance that they were not alone even in this hostile place.
The Sea of Moyle had no shores in the way Lake Derravaragh had shores, no gentle slopes leading down to water, no reeds or quiet inlets where a swan could rest undisturbed. There were only rocks, black and sharp and slippery with algae, cliffs rising sheer from the water, and small rocky islands barely large enough for the 4 swans to stand upon, offering minimal shelter from the wind that blew constantly, relentlessly from the north and west, bringing with it the smell of deeper ocean, of storms brewing far out to sea, of ice and endings.
They found a small island that first day, barely more than a large rock, really, but flat enough on top that they could climb onto it, could rest briefly out of the water, could preen their feathers and try to recover from the long flight and the shock of the cold. They pressed together, tucking their heads under their wings, trying to conserve heat, trying to rest, but sleep would not come. The wind too loud, the cold too penetrating, the fear too present. Night fell quickly this far north, the sun sliding below the horizon earlier than it had at Lake Derravaragh, and with the darkness came worse cold, a cold that seemed almost malevolent in its intensity, as though the night itself wanted to kill them, to freeze them solid where they huddled. They shivered uncontrollably, their bodies burning energy trying to stay warm, energy they could not spare, energy they would need to hunt for food when morning came, if morning came, if they survived the night. They survived. They always survived, because the curse would not let them die, would not grant them that mercy. They survived the first night, and the second, and the third, each one as terrible as the last, each one teaching them new aspects of suffering they had not previously imagined possible. They learned what it meant to be truly cold, cold not just of body but of spirit, cold that seeped into their thoughts and slowed them, dulled them, made thinking difficult, made memory hard to access, made staying human harder than it had ever been. They learned to hunt for food in salt water, diving deep for fish that tasted strange and oily, for shellfish clinging to rocks below the waterline, for anything edible they could find in this harsh environment where food was scarce and hard won. They learned to time their diving with the waves, to avoid being smashed against rocks, to navigate currents that tried to pull them out to sea or push them against cliffs, to survive in water that was actively hostile rather than merely indifferent. Storms came frequently, blowing up quickly from the north, turning the sea violent and deadly. During these storms, the swans could only huddle on their small rock and endure, battered by wind and spray, unable to seek shelter because there was no shelter, unable to dive beneath the surface because the waves were too powerful, would dash them against rocks if they tried. They endured with their eyes closed against the stinging salt spray, their feathers plastered to their bodies, their strength draining away with each hour the storm raged, hoping only that it would pass before they were swept away, before their grip on the slippery rock failed, before exhaustion took them and they drowned. Winter in the Sea of Moyle was worse than any winter they had experienced at Lake Derravaragh, worse than they had imagined winter could be. The water did not freeze solid as the lake had, was too salty and too turbulent for that, but ice formed anyway, forming on the swans themselves, crusting their feathers, weighing them down, restricting movement. They would wake after brief periods of fitful sleep to find themselves encased in ice, ice covering their backs, their wings, their heads, ice so thick they could barely move, could barely breathe, had to thrash violently to break free, shattering the ice shell and sending fragments flying, only to have more ice form within hours, the cycle repeating endlessly through the long winter months. The ice was beautiful in a terrible way, catching what little light filtered through the constant cloud cover, transforming the swans into crystalline sculptures, frozen moments of suffering made aesthetic. They hated the beauty of it, hated how their torment became spectacle, became something that might be considered lovely by an observer who did not understand, who did not feel the weight, the cold, the pain.
They were separated once, early in the second winter, caught by a particularly violent storm that scattered them across the sea, each swan fighting alone for survival, unable to see their siblings through the driving rain and spray, unable to hear their calls over the roar of wind and waves. The separation was worse than the physical danger, worse than the cold or the exhaustion or the fear of drowning. It was abandonment, isolation, the loss of the only thing that made their existence bearable. The eldest girl fought through the storm alone, swimming against currents that tried to carry her away, her wings too waterlogged to fly, her strength failing but her will absolute, because she could not die, would not die without seeing her siblings again, without knowing they survived. She called and called, her voice lost in the storm, searching through the chaos for some answering sound, some sign that she was not alone. The eldest boy was slammed against rocks repeatedly, his body bruised and battered, one wing bent at a wrong angle, pain shooting through him with each movement. But he kept swimming, kept searching, pulling himself along the rocks when he could not swim, refusing to give up, refusing to surrender to the storm or the sea or the curse, fighting with a ferocity born of love and desperation and the absolute refusal to lose his siblings again.
The younger boy was carried far out to sea, beyond sight of land, surrounded by gray water and gray sky with no distinction between them, no horizon, no reference point, only infinite grayness in all directions. He could have given up then, could have stopped swimming and let the sea take him, but he did not. Some core of stubbornness keeping him going, keeping him swimming in what he hoped was the right direction, toward where he thought the islands might be, toward where his siblings might be searching for him. The youngest was swept into a narrow channel between rocks, trapped there by the currents, battered against stone walls on either side, her small body helpless against the water's force. She fought with everything she had, her strength disproportionate to her size, her will unbreakable despite her terror, her love for her siblings stronger than her fear of death, pulling her forward, keeping her struggling when struggle seemed futile. The storm passed eventually, as storms always do, and in the gray, exhausted aftermath, the swans found each other again. One by one, they converged on the small rocky island that had become their gathering point, their home such as it was, swimming weakly, barely able to stay afloat, but alive, together, whole. They pressed close, trembling, making soft sounds of relief and recognition, checking each other for injuries, reassuring themselves that this was real, that they had all survived, that the separation had not been permanent. The eldest boy's wing healed slowly, crookedly, never quite right afterward, a permanent reminder of that storm, that separation, that moment when they had almost lost each other. He learned to compensate, to fly despite the damaged wing, but it hurt, always hurt, a low, constant ache that intensified in cold weather, which was every day in the Sea of Moyle. After that storm, they developed a system, a way of staying connected even during the worst weather. They tied themselves together, not physically, but through constant vocalization, calling to each other continuously during storms, maintaining an auditory link that helped them stay oriented, stay close, stay together. Their voices grew hoarse from the constant calling, their throats raw from shouting over wind and waves, but they kept calling, because silence meant isolation, and isolation meant the possibility of permanent separation, and that was unthinkable, unbearable, the one thing they could not survive. Years passed in the Sea of Moyle the way they had passed at Lake Derravaragh, slowly,
painfully, each one distinct in its suffering, but blurring together in memory, becoming one long nightmare of cold and hunger and storms and ice. They marked time by winters, counting them, using the count as a way to measure progress toward the end of this exile, toward the day when they could leave this terrible place and move to the third lake, which could not possibly be worse than this, could not possibly demand more of them than they had already given. But time felt different here than it had on the lake. At Lake Derravaragh, the years had been gentle, soft-edged, blending into each other like watercolors. Here they were sharp, distinct, each one cutting into them, leaving scars. At the lake, they feared forgetting their humanity. Here, they feared losing it through sheer attrition, worn away by constant suffering until nothing remained but animal consciousness, swan minds in swan bodies, with no memory of ever being anything else. They fought against this erosion with their evening ritual, gathering each day as the light failed to sing their human songs, to tell their human stories, to remind each other and themselves of who they had been, who they still were beneath the feathers and the suffering. But the ritual was harder here, their voices rougher from constant exposure to salt and wind, their memories harder to access, buried under layers of pain and exhaustion and the simple daily struggle to survive. Sometimes they failed to gather, stopped by storms, or separated by currents, or simply too exhausted to make the effort. These failures frightened them more than the physical dangers, felt like small deaths, small surrenders to the curse, small steps toward becoming entirely swan and losing the last vestiges of their human selves. They tried to make up for missed evenings by extending the next one, by singing longer, telling more stories, holding on to their humanity with desperate intensity, but the gaps accumulated and they felt themselves slipping, losing ground, fighting a battle they could not win but could not afford to lose. Human contact became rare. The Sea of Moyle was a barrier, a dividing line between lands, not a destination. Ships passed occasionally, fishermen in small boats hugging the coast, traders making the crossing between Ireland and Scotland. But these ships did not linger, did not stop, and the people aboard had no reason to notice 4 swans among the rocks and waves. The swans watched these ships with longing and despair, seeing humanity at a distance, forever separated from it, unable to call out, unable to signal their true nature, unable to bridge the gap between what they appeared to be and what they were. Once a ship foundered in a storm within sight of their island, the hull breaking apart on rocks, men struggling in the water, their shouts carrying across the waves. The swans watched helplessly, unable to aid, unable to do anything but witness as the men drowned one by one, their struggles weakening, their cries fading, until the sea claimed them all and the wreckage drifted away and only silence remained. The swans grieved for those men, strangers they had never spoken to, but they grieved too for themselves, for their inability to help, for the cruel fact that they had human minds but not human hands, could understand the tragedy but could not prevent it. The incident haunted them for years, replaying in their minds during quiet moments, another layer of suffering added to all the rest. They wondered if they could have done something, if swans could somehow rescue drowning men, but they knew the answer was no, knew that they were as helpless as the men had been, perhaps more so, because the men at least had died quickly, while the swans had to continue living, continue enduring, continue surviving when survival felt less like a gift and more like punishment. Seasons cycled, but with less distinction than at the lake. Winter was coldest, but spring brought little warmth, summer barely warmer than spring, autumn merely the prelude to another winter. The world here was shades of gray and blue and black, colors leached out by constant cloud cover, by the gray sea and gray sky and gray rocks, everything gray except the white of their feathers, and even that seemed to be fading, becoming duller, as though the sea of moil were draining the color from them, turning them as gray as everything else. They saw other birds sometimes, migrants passing through, gulls that lived on the cliffs, occasional eagles hunting from above. These birds lived their normal bird lives, unconcerned with the strangeness of 4 swans who did not behave quite like swans, who stayed always in the same place, who seemed to suffer from something beyond the normal hardships of survival. The other birds gave them space, perhaps sensing their strangeness, perhaps responding to some residual magic that clung to them, marked them as other, as cursed, as best avoided.
Loneliness became another burden, as heavy as the cold, as constant as the wind. They had each other, yes, but they were only 4, only family, with no possibility of expanding that circle, no possibility of new relationships or connections. They lived in enforced intimacy, knowing each other completely, every gesture, every habit, every fear and hope and memory, until there was no privacy, no mystery, no space between them. This intimacy was both comfort and confinement, necessary for survival, but suffocating in its totality. They bickered sometimes, small irritations magnified by proximity and stress, by the constant grinding pressure of their exile. The eldest girl grew bossy, trying to control every aspect of their survival, making decisions for the group without consultation. The eldest boy grew resentful, chafing at her authority, wanting more autonomy, even though autonomy in this place meant danger. The younger boy withdrew, became silent and sullen, contributing less to the evening rituals, losing himself in some interior space the others could not access. The youngest became clingy, demanding constant reassurance, her neediness exhausting the others even as they tried to meet it. But their love remained stronger than their irritation, their bond deeper than their conflicts. They forgave each other quickly, instinctively, because they understood the pressure they were all under, because they knew that the bickering was just a release valve for suffering that had no other outlet, because they needed each other too much to let small grievances grow into lasting rifts. One winter, the ice was so thick and persistent that they could not break free of it for days, were trapped in shells of ice on their rock, unable to move, barely able to breathe, suffocating slowly in crystalline prisons. They thought they might die then, thought the curse might finally release them. But on the 4th day, a storm brought warmer air and rain instead of sleet, and the ice melted enough for them to break free, gasping and weak, their bodies cramped and damaged from the confinement, but alive, still condemned to continue. They learned to read the sea's moods, to predict storms by the color of the water, the movement of clouds, the direction of the wind. They learned which rocks offered the most shelter, which channels were navigable and which were death traps, which fish ran when and where, all the small details of survival in a hostile environment. This knowledge kept them alive, but brought no satisfaction, no sense of accomplishment, only the grim awareness that they were becoming expert in their own suffering, specialized in endurance. Time lost its linear quality, became circular, each year a repeat of the last, each winter the same winter, each storm the same storm, until past and present and future collapsed into one eternal moment of cold and suffering with no beginning and no end. They lost count of the years, had to start over multiple times when they realized they had forgotten where they were in the count, how many winters had passed, how many remained. The confusion frightened them, felt like losing their grip on reality, like sliding into madness. But they forced themselves to count again, to mark the passage of time even when time no longer seemed to move, because counting gave them purpose,
gave them a way to measure progress toward freedom, even if that freedom was still centuries away. They developed a new song during this time, a song of endurance, of survival, a song that had no words even in human language, but was purely emotional, purely expressive of suffering endured, of will sustained, of love persisting against all odds. They sang it together on the worst nights, when the storms were strongest, when the ice was thickest, when hope was hardest to hold, and the song became a spell of its own, a counter-curse that did not break the transformation, but made it bearable, or if not bearable, then at least survivable, at least possible to continue. The song attracted attention once, a group of monks in a small boat who heard it carrying across the water and rowed closer, thinking perhaps they had found some holy mystery, some evidence of angels or divine presence. They saw only swans, but swans singing strangely, with voices that seemed almost human, almost meaningful. The monks listened for a long time, their boat bobbing in the gentle waves, their faces rapt with wonder and something like fear. One of the monks crossed himself repeatedly. Another began to weep, though he could not have said why, only that the song touched something deep in him, spoke to some grief or longing he had not known he carried. The eldest monk, white-bearded and worn with years, stared at the swans with sharp intelligence, and for a moment the swans thought he understood, thought he saw through the enchantment to the human souls trapped beneath. But then he shook his head and ordered the boat turned around, rowing away quickly, leaving the swans alone once more. The encounter gave them hope briefly, the thought that they might still be recognized, that their humanity might still be visible to those who looked closely enough. But as days passed with no return of the monks, no rescue, no breaking of the curse, the hope faded, replaced by the familiar despair, the understanding that recognition without action was meaningless, that being seen without being saved was just another form of torture. Years continued their slow march. 100 winters passed, then 200, then 250. The swans aged in strange ways, their swan bodies somehow remaining vital, even as their human minds accumulated centuries of experience, of memory, of trauma. They felt ancient and newborn simultaneously, old souls in bodies that never grew old, consciousness stretched thin across time until it should have snapped, but somehow held, somehow continued. They began to fear the third lake more than they had initially, not because they thought it would be worse than the Sea of Moyle, nothing could be worse than this, but because the third lake would be the last, would be the final test, and if they could not endure it, if they broke there after 600 years of survival, then everything would have been for nothing, all the suffering wasted, all the endurance meaningless. The thought terrified them, this possibility of failing at the very end, of coming so close to release only to lose themselves in the final centuries, to forget who they were just before the curse broke and made them human again. So they held on tighter to their humanity, practiced their evening rituals more faithfully, even exhausted, reminded each other constantly of their names, their father's name, the name of their homeland, the details of their human lives, storing these things in multiple redundant memories so that if one swan forgot, the others could remind, could restore, could keep the truth alive among them. The final years in the Sea of Moyle were the hardest, not because the conditions worsened, but because they knew the end was approaching, and the temptation to give up, to stop fighting, to coast through the remaining time on pure momentum was almost overwhelming. But they resisted, kept struggling, kept surviving actively rather than passively, because they understood that passive survival was the first step toward losing themselves, toward becoming truly swan, toward making the curse permanent in form if not in effect. And then, finally, impossibly, the 300 years ended. They felt the change like they had before, a shifting in the magical bonds, a loosening of the compulsion that held them to this place. The third exile beckoned, the final lake waited, and the swans gathered their failing strength for one more flight, one more journey, one more beginning that was also an ending, one more trial in a life that had become nothing but trials, endured because there was no alternative, because love required it, because somewhere in the future, still centuries away but closer now than ever before, freedom waited, and they would reach it or die trying. And either way, eventually, this would end.
The flight west and north from the Sea of Moyle was shorter than the flight north had been from Lake Derravaragh, but the swans were weaker now, damaged in ways that went deeper than their bodies, worn down by 600 years of cold and suffering and the sheer weight of endured time. They flew slowly, stopping frequently to rest, their wings aching, their hearts aching more, everything aching in ways that had no physical source but were real nonetheless, pain written into their souls by centuries of exile. The landscape below changed as they flew, becoming wilder, emptier, more remote. Human habitation thinned to scattered farms, then to nothing, only wilderness stretching in all directions, mountains and moorland, lakes and rivers, forests of a kind they had not seen in centuries, dark and deep and ancient, untouched by human hands. This far north, this far from civilization, the world felt primordial, unchanged, as though they had flown backward through time to an age before humans, before history, before everything they knew. Lake Innisglora appeared suddenly, a surprise of silver water in the midst of desolation, not large, but perfect in its way, formed by a ring of low hills that sheltered it from the worst winds, fed by springs and streams, surrounded by strange, twisted trees that grew despite the harsh climate, stubborn and resilient. The lake was clear as glass, so clear they could see the bottom even from the air, see the stones and sand and submerged logs, see fish moving in slow schools, see their own reflections approaching from above. They landed gently, almost afraid to disturb the stillness, and the water received them quietly, barely rippling, as though the lake had been waiting for them, expecting them, prepared to serve as their home for the next 300 years. The water was cold but not cruel, clean and fresh after the salt of the Sea of Moyle, tasting of stone and earth and something mineral they could not name. They floated for a long time without moving, simply resting, recovering from the flight, letting the peace of the place seep into them, healing in small ways the damage the sea had inflicted. Lake Innisglora was different from the other places, gentler than the Sea of Moyle, wilder than Lake Derravaragh, existing in some middle space that was neither comfort nor torment, but something more neutral, more accepting. The shores were rocky but not dangerously so, offering places to rest that did not require constant vigilance. The water held fish enough to eat without struggle. The weather was harsh but predictable, storms coming with warning, ice forming slowly rather than suddenly. It was a place designed for endurance rather than suffering, a place where they could exist rather than merely survive. They found a small island near the center of the lake, barely more than a rise of stone breaking the surface, but flat enough to rest on, large enough for all four of them with room to spare. They claimed it as their own, began to think of it as home in a way they had never been able to think of the rocks in the Sea of Moyle, began to create small rituals of habitation, small ways of marking the space as theirs, as belonging to them even if they belonged nowhere. The silence here was profound, deeper than any silence they had experienced, a silence that was not absence of sound, but presence of stillness, of peace, of something very old and patient watching without judgment. At first, the silence unsettled them, made them nervous, their minds so accustomed to the constant noise of wind and waves that quiet felt wrong, dangerous, like the calm before a storm.
But gradually they accepted it, learned to rest in it, found that the silence created space for thoughts they had not been able to think in the chaos of the Sea of Moyle, memories they had not been able to access, feelings they had not been able to feel. They wept often in those early days at Lake Innisglora, weeping they had not done during the previous exile, because there had been no space for weeping, no time, no energy, everything consumed by survival. Here, with survival slightly less demanding, the grief they had been carrying rushed forward, overwhelming them, and they cried without restraint, their swan voices making sounds of such pure sorrow that the very air seemed to mourn with them, the lake water seeming to rise toward them in sympathy, the trees bending as though bowed by the weight of their sadness. They grieved for their lost childhoods, for their father, for their mother, for all the years they had endured, for all the years still to come. They grieved for their bodies, beautiful as swans, but wrong, not theirs, stolen from them by jealousy and magic and cruelty. They grieved for their separation from humanity, for the isolation that had defined their existence for 600 years, for the knowledge that when they finally returned to human form, if they returned, the world would be so changed they would not recognize it, would be strangers in their own land, exiles even after exile ended. The weeping exhausted them, but also cleansed them somehow, drained away some of the poison the Sea of Moyle had poured into them, made space for something other than suffering, though what that something might be they could not yet say. They emerged from the grief feeling lighter, emptier, ready to begin this final exile, not with hope exactly, but a kind of resigned acceptance, an understanding that this was the last stretch, that if they could endure 300 more years, freedom waited on the other side, and if they could not endure, then at least the struggle would be over. Time moved differently at Lake Innisglora, slower than at the Sea of Moyle, but faster than Lake Derravaragh, some middle pace that was almost comfortable, almost bearable. Days had a pleasant rhythm, wake with the dawn, feed in the shallows, rest through midday, swim in the afternoon, gather for songs and stories as evening fell, sleep through the dark hours, repeat. The routine created a framework that held them together, gave structure to time that otherwise might have dissolved into formless duration. They saw no humans, none at all, not for years, not for decades. Lake Innisglora was too remote, too far from trade routes or settlements, surrounded by terrain too difficult to traverse for casual travelers. The isolation was both blessing and curse, blessing because it meant no painful reminders of what they had lost, no watching humanity from a distance, no encounters that highlighted their exclusion, curse because it meant total solitude, no connection to the human world they still considered themselves part of, despite 600 years of separation. The lack of human contact affected them in unexpected ways. Their memories of human life, so carefully preserved through centuries, began to feel less like memories and more like stories, like myths they had heard rather than experiences they had lived. They remembered being children, but the memories had a strange quality now, dreamlike, unanchored to reality, as though they were remembering something that happened to someone else in another lifetime. They fought against this fading, rehearsed their memories more frequently, told their stories with more detail, but the truth was that 600 years created a distance that no amount of repetition could fully bridge, and they were losing the visceral sense of having been human, even as they retained the intellectual knowledge of it. The world was changing while they remained static. They did not see the changes directly, isolated as they were, but they felt them, sensed them in ways they could not articulate. The air itself felt different, the quality of light, the behavior of animals, the very substance of reality shifting in response to forces they could not perceive. Magic was draining from the world completely now, not just fading, but actively being expelled, pushed out by something new, something that had no room for curses or transformations or the old wild powers that once shaped destinies. Christianity came to Lake Innisglora in their 2nd century there. They saw it first as a thin column of smoke rising from the southern shore, too regular to be natural fire, too persistent to be accident. Then they saw figures moving, small at this distance, humans building something, clearing land, creating settlement where none had been before. Over weeks and months, a structure took shape, walls of stone, a roof of thatch, a bell tower rising above the rest, simple but solid, built to last. Monks, the swans realized, a monastery being established in this remote place, these holy men seeking isolation for prayer and contemplation, finding it here at the lake, unknowing that they shared the water with 4 cursed souls who had been seeking isolation of a different kind for centuries. The monks rang bells to mark the hours, and the sound carried across the water, clear and sweet and strange, nothing like any sound the swans had heard before. The bells spoke of order, of time measured and marked, of human ritual and human faith, and hearing them was painful in a way the swans had not anticipated, because the bells were beautiful, and because beauty in the midst of suffering felt like cruelty, felt like the world mocking them with reminders of what they could not have, could not be part of, only observe from a distance.
But the bells were also important, crucially important, though the swans did not understand this immediately. The bells meant the new religion had reached even this far corner of the world, meant that one condition of the curse was being fulfilled, meant that freedom was no longer just a distant abstraction, but an approaching reality, still centuries away, but real, actual, possible. The monks noticed the swans eventually, saw them on their island, remarked on their strangeness, their constancy, the way they stayed always together, always in the same place, as though bound by something beyond normal swan behavior. Some of the monks thought the swans were holy, were signs of divine presence or blessing. Others thought they were uncanny, possibly demonic, definitely unnatural, and argued that they should be driven away or killed. The debates happened at a distance the swans could not hear, but they felt the attention, the speculation, the human consciousness once again turned toward them, trying to understand what could not be understood without knowing the full story. One monk in particular seemed fascinated by the swans, watched them constantly, spent hours sitting on the shore with a writing tablet, sketching them, recording observations, building some theory or narrative that the swans could not guess. He was younger than the others, his movements quick and curious, his face mobile and expressive even at a distance. The swans found themselves watching him in return, drawn by his attention, by the sense that he saw something in them even if he could not quite name what he saw. The monk began leaving food on the shore sometimes, small offerings of bread that the swans did not eat, could not eat, their swan bodies designed for different sustenance. But they appreciated the gesture, understood it as an attempt at connection, at communication across the unbridgeable gap between species, between cursed and uncursed, between those who belonged to the world and those who merely existed in it. The seasons at Lake Innisglora were distinct, but gentle in their transitions, not the harsh shifts of the Sea of Moyle, but gradual changes that gave time to adapt, to prepare. Spring brought wildflowers to the shores, blues and purples and whites, coloring the gray-green landscape, attracting insects that fed the fish that fed the swans, everything connected in cycles that had nothing to do with human concerns or swan curses, but simply existed, perpetual and indifferent. The summer brought long light, the sun barely setting in the far north, the days stretching into near continuous brightness that made sleep difficult, but allowed more time for swimming, for flying short distances around the lake, for existing outside the usual constraints of day and night. Autumn brought migrating birds, thousands of them passing through, stopping at the lake to rest before continuing south,
and the four cursed swans watched these migrations with complex feelings, envying the birds their freedom of movement, their natural place in the cycle of seasons, their ability to fly away from cold rather than enduring it. The migrants regarded the four white swans with curiosity or indifference, depending on species, some approaching, some avoiding, none understanding what they were seeing, that these four were different, were trapped, were enduring what the migrants could escape. The winter at Lake Innisglora was cold, but nothing like the Sea of Moyle, cold that could be managed, survived without constant struggle. The lake froze partially, leaving open water in the center fed by springs, and the swans learned to stay in this unfrozen area, learning which parts froze first, which stayed liquid longest, developing a map of the lake's winter geography that guided them through each cold season. Snow fell heavily, blanketing the landscape in white that matched their feathers, making them nearly invisible against it, ghosts haunting a ghost lake, present but unseen, existing in some liminal space between reality and story.
The monastery bells rang through every season, marking hours even when no humans were awake to hear them. The sound carrying across ice and water and snow, a constant reminder that time was passing, that the world was turning, that even in this remote place, disconnected from everything, time marched forward toward some unknown future, some eventual ending. The young monk died. They saw the funeral from a distance, saw the other monks carrying his body to a burial ground behind the monastery, saw the rituals of Christian death, so different from the rituals they remembered from their childhood, from the old ways that were being forgotten, replaced by this new faith with its new ceremonies. The swans mourned him in their way, singing their evening song with particular intensity that night, honoring the loss of someone who had seen them, had tried to understand them, had offered kindness even without comprehension. New monks came to replace those who died, and these new monks knew only what they had been told about the swans, stories passed down, becoming legend, becoming myth, the truth buried under layers of interpretation and imagination. The swans heard themselves spoken of as miracles, as tests, as symbols, as everything except what they were, cursed children growing old in swan bodies, enduring because they had no choice, waiting because waiting was all they could do. The world beyond the lake changed in ways they could only imagine. Kingdoms rose and fell, wars were fought, plagues swept through human populations, technologies developed, languages evolved, cultures shifted and blended and transformed. All of this happened somewhere else, in the world the swans could not access, had not been part of for 800 years, would not rejoin for another century. They existed outside history, parallel to it, untouched by its currents, suspended in their own private time that intersected with the larger flow only at this one point, this lake, this monastery, these bells ringing hours that meant nothing to them except as measures of time still to endure. Their humanity continued its slow erosion despite their best efforts. They forgot things, small things at first, the exact layout of their childhood home, the names of servants, the words to songs they had once known perfectly. Then larger things, their mother's face, the sound of their father's voice, the feeling of human hands, human touch, human warmth. The forgetting terrified them, but they could not stop it, could only watch as pieces of their past dissolved like morning fog, leaving only the knowledge that something had been there without the ability to recall what it had been. But some things remained, core things, essential things. They remembered they were siblings. They remembered they had been human. They remembered they had been loved and had loved in return. These facts were bedrock, unchanging, the foundation everything else was built on. And as long as they held these truths, they told themselves, they remained essentially human, essentially themselves, regardless of how much peripheral detail faded away.
The final century at Lake Innisglora passed more quickly than the previous two, time accelerating as it does near endings, pulling them forward with increasing speed toward the moment of release. They felt it approaching the way animals feel weather changing, some instinct deeper than thought warning them that transformation was coming again, that the curse was reaching its conclusion, that everything was about to change once more. And they did not know whether to hope or fear, whether the change would be salvation or simply a different form of suffering, whether they would survive it or whether it would finally, mercifully destroy them. The bells rang on, measuring hours, marking days, counting down toward a moment none of them could see, but all of them could feel approaching, inevitable as winter, inexorable as time, final as death, or perhaps, if they were fortunate, final as freedom.
The last day began like any other. No fanfare, no obvious signs that this was the day the curse would break, the day 900 years would end, the day the Children of Lir would become human again or die trying. The swans woke with the dawn, as they always did, the light creeping across the lake in familiar patterns, the water holding the morning cold, the air still and quiet except for the distant sound of monastery bells ringing matins, calling monks to prayer as they had done every morning for the past 2 centuries. The swans felt different, but could not have said how. Some subtle shift in the magical bonds that held them, a loosening that was not yet release but approached it, promised it, like the first crack in ice that predicts the spring thaw. They swam to their island, climbed onto the rock, settled into positions they had occupied thousands of times before, and waited, though they did not know consciously what they were waiting for, only that something was coming, something was changing, something was about to break. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher. The winter sun gave little warmth this far north, hung low and distant in the gray sky. The swans preened their feathers mechanically, their swan bodies going through familiar motions while their human minds drifted, remembering, preparing, gathering themselves for whatever came next. They thought about their father, long dead, dust for centuries. They thought about their mother, dead even longer, barely remembered. They thought about their childhood, that brief golden time before the curse, before the loss, before 900 years of exile transformed them into something neither fully human nor fully swan. Midday passed. The bells rang. The swans heard footsteps approaching along the shore. Human footsteps. The sound of boots on stone, deliberate and purposeful, coming toward the water's edge nearest their island. They looked up and saw a figure, a monk, not one they recognized, younger than most, dressed in the simple brown robes of his order, carrying something they could not quite see at this distance. The monk stopped at the water's edge. He lifted what he carried, a small bell, handheld, simple in design, and he rang it. The sound was pure and clear, cutting across the water, reaching the swans with crystalline clarity, and they felt something shatter inside them, felt the magical bonds that had held them for 900 years suddenly crack, split, break apart like ice under too much weight. The transformation began. It was like the first transformation, but reversed, bodies changing from swan to human, feathers dissolving, bones reshaping, necks shortening, wings becoming arms, beaks softening into mouths and noses, webbed feet splitting into toes, everything unwinding, everything reversing, the curse finally, impossibly breaking. But they were not children anymore. The curse had preserved them in swan form, but had not stopped time completely, had not prevented aging entirely. As their bodies became human again, 900 years caught up with them all at once, 9 centuries of accumulated age crashing down on them like a wave, bending them, breaking them, reducing them from swans in their prime to humans at the very end of life, ancient beyond ancient, bodies withered and fragile and failing. They collapsed on the rock, no longer covered in white feathers, but in wrinkled skin, thin and translucent as paper, showing every vein, every bone, every mark of extreme age. Their hair, what remained of it, was pure white, sparse and fine as spider silk. Their hands were twisted, fingers bent with arthritis or simple deterioration, knuckles swollen, nails yellowed and thick. Their faces were maps of time, creased with lines too numerous to count, skin sagging from bones that seemed too large for the flesh that covered them. They tried to speak, but their voices came out as croaks, rough and unused. Throats that had made only swan sounds for 900 years suddenly required to form human words, human language, and the muscles did not remember how. The mouth did not know the shapes anymore. They coughed, gasped, tried again, and this time managed words, single words at first, then phrases, their voices cracking and weak, but undeniably human. "Sister," the eldest boy whispered, reaching for his eldest sister with a trembling hand, his arm barely able to lift itself, the effort enormous, exhausting. "Brother," she whispered back, and they touched, palm to palm, skin to skin for the first time in 900 years, and the sensation was overwhelming, too much after so long without it, too intense, too real, too painfully beautiful. The younger children, though they were not children, had not been children for centuries, were older than any human should be, reached for each other as well, hands finding hands, fingers intertwining, holding with what little strength remained, touching to confirm that this was real, that they were truly human again, that the curse had finally released them. The monk on the shore saw the transformation, saw 4 ancient humans where 4 swans had been, and he cried out in shock and fear and wonder, dropping his bell, making signs against evil, stumbling backward. Then he recovered himself, remembered his calling, his compassion, and he waded into the water, not caring about the cold, reaching the rock, reaching the 4 ancient people who lay there barely breathing, barely alive, their bodies dying even as their curse broke, even as they finally became human again. He spoke to them in a language they did not know at first, the words unfamiliar, the sounds wrong, everything changed while they had been swans, even language transformed into something unrecognizable. But gradually meaning filtered through, his tone conveying what his words could not, his hands gentle as he examined them, his face full of pity and awe, and the particular kind of grief holy people feel when confronted with suffering they cannot prevent. More monks came, wading into the water, carefully lifting the 4 fragile bodies, carrying them to shore, wrapping them in wool blankets, trying to warm them, trying to help even though help might be impossible, even though these people were dying, were already more than halfway dead, had been dying for 900 years, and were only now reaching the final moment of that long, slow death. They were carried to the monastery, laid in beds near the fire, given water to drink, bread softened in milk, basic sustenance their bodies could barely process, stomachs too shrunken, throats too weak, everything failing simultaneously. The monks prayed over them, constant prayers in Latin, asking their God for mercy, for miracles, for anything that might preserve these lives that had endured so much, suffered so long, deserved better than to die within hours of breaking free. The children of Lir lay in their beds and felt their bodies shutting down, organs failing, hearts slowing, breath becoming shallower with each rise and fall of their chests. They were not afraid. Fear requires energy they no longer had, requires a future they did not possess, requires some investment in continuing when continuing was clearly impossible. They were past fear, beyond it, in some state that was not quite acceptance and not quite indifference, but simply presence,
simply existing in this final moment without resistance, without struggle, without anything except awareness that this was the end, and the end was all right, was maybe even good, was certainly earned. They could speak, barely, in whispers that the monks had to lean close to hear, putting ears near mouths to catch the faint words. The children spoke to each other, mostly, finding after 900 years they had nothing to say to strangers, no matter how kind, no matter how compassionate. They had things to say to each other, though, final things, important things, things that had waited 900 years to be spoken and could not wait any longer. "We survived," the eldest girl whispered, and her siblings murmured agreement. Yes, they had survived. They had endured. They had made it through all 900 years, through 3 lakes and 3 exiles, and suffering beyond measure, and they had survived it together, and that mattered. That meant something. That was victory of a kind, even if victory tasted like ashes, even if winning meant dying. "We stayed together," the eldest boy added, his voice thinner than his sister's, fading faster, his heart weaker, his body giving out more quickly. "Never separated, never alone." "We remembered," the younger boy whispered, tears leaking from his closed eyes, tracking down his withered cheeks. "We stayed human inside. We remembered who we were." "We loved each other," the youngest said, her voice strongest despite her body being smallest, most fragile, as though will alone kept her speaking. "We loved Father, we loved Mother, we loved being human, we never stopped loving." They fell silent then, too exhausted to continue, and the silence stretched, filled only with the sound of their breathing, ragged and irregular, each breath an effort, each one possibly the last. The monks watched helplessly, praying more fervently, hoping for a miracle that did not come, that was never going to come, because the curse had already given its miracle, had already released them, and asking for more was asking for what could not be given. The eldest girl died first, her breath simply stopping between one moment and the next, her body going still, her hand loosening in her sister's grip, releasing finally, surrendering at last. The youngest felt her sister leave, felt the absence like a physical wound, and she cried out, a sound of such pure grief that the monks fell silent in their prayers, overwhelmed by the rawness of it, the human truth of it, the love made audible in that terrible sound. The eldest boy followed minutes later, his heart giving out, unable to sustain even this brief period of humanity, unable to beat any longer after 900 years of beating inside a swan's chest, too tired, too worn, too ready to stop. He went quietly, a sigh more than a death, slipping away without drama, without struggle, simply ceasing. The younger boy lasted longer, another hour, maybe 2, time difficult to measure in that room full of dying and prayer and the smoke from the fire that burned to keep them warm. He held his youngest sister's hand the entire time, refusing to let go, staying with her, keeping her company as they had kept each other company through 9 centuries of exile, loyal to the end, faithful to each other, if not to any god. When he died, the youngest was alone, the last of them, the final child of Lir. She lay in her bed and felt the absence of her siblings like amputation, like missing limbs, like missing parts of herself that had been torn away, leaving her incomplete, broken, unable to function properly without them. She wanted to follow them immediately, wanted to die and rejoin them wherever they had gone, wanted to be together again, because 900 years of togetherness made separation unbearable, unthinkable, impossible. But her body would not cooperate, stubbornly continued breathing, stubbornly continued existing, clinging to life with the same tenacity that had sustained her through the exile, through the suffering, through everything. She lasted through the night, through the morning, through another day and night, the monks amazed at her endurance, whispering that she must have great holiness in her, great strength, great purpose. She had no holiness, she had only love and memory and a story that needed telling. In her final hours she spoke, her voice barely audible, and the young monk who rang the bell sat beside her and listened, writing down what he could understand, preserving what she said, capturing the story of the Children of Lir, the 900 years, the 3 exiles, the curse and its breaking, everything she could tell him before her voice failed, before her breath ran out, before she died. She told him about being children, about their father's love, about swimming in the lake, about the games they played, about the songs they sang. She told him about Aoife's jealousy, about the transformation, about learning to be swans while staying human inside. She told him about Lake Derravaragh, about seeing their father and not being recognized, about the slow passage of centuries. She told him about the Sea of Moyle, about the cold and the storms and the ice that froze them nearly solid, about separation and reunion and endurance beyond endurance. She told him about Lake Glora, about the bells that rang across the water, about waiting, always waiting, for 900 years of waiting. And when she finished, when there was nothing left to tell, when the story had been given to someone who could carry it forward into whatever future waited, she closed her eyes and let go, released her grip on life, joined her siblings in death, reunited finally, completely, permanently. The monks buried them together in a single grave behind the monastery, 4 ancient bodies interred in one plot, together in death as they were in life, as they had been through 900 years of curse, as they would be forever in whatever came after death, if anything came after death. They marked the grave with a simple stone carved with 4 swans, necks intertwined, and beneath the image they carved the names the youngest had told them before dying: Fionnuala, Aed, Fiachra, and Khan. The Children of Lir, the Swan children, the ones who endured.
The lake remains. Glora still sits in the north, ringed by hills, fed by springs, cold and clear and beautiful in its desolation. The monastery fell to ruin centuries ago, its stones scattered, its walls collapsed, its memory faded except in stories, in histories, in the archaeological record that notes a small religious settlement existed here between the 9th and 12th centuries, occupied by monks whose names are lost, whose prayers are forgotten, whose daily lives left almost no trace. But the lake remembers. Water holds memory differently than stone or flesh, holds it in the movement of currents, in the temperature gradients between surface and depth, in the chemical composition that changes infinitesimally with each season, each rain, each bit of matter that falls into it and dissolves. The lake remembers 4 swans that lived here for 300 years, that died here as humans, that were buried here in ground that has since been disturbed and redistributed by time and weather and the slow processes of geological change. The grave is gone, the stones scattered or buried, the bones long since dissolved into soil, into nutrients, into the substance of trees and grass and whatever else grows in this place. No marker remains to show where the Children of Lir were buried. No monument preserves their memory in physical form. But the story persists, passed down through generations, written in manuscripts, preserved in oral tradition, repeated and embellished and transformed over centuries, until it is impossible to separate truth from legend, fact from fiction, what actually happened from what people wished had happened. Some versions say they were canonized, declared saints by a church that did not exist when they were children, that arrived during their exile, that found them only at the very end.
These versions claim miracles, claim healing powers associated with their memory, claim that prayers to the Children of Lir bring results, grant wishes, solve problems. There is no evidence for this. The Church's official records do not list them among the saints, but folk belief persists regardless of official recognition, and people still sometimes come to the lake, to the general area where the monastery once stood, leaving offerings, saying prayers, asking favors from 4 children who died over 1,000 years ago. Other versions focus on the tragedy, on the cruelty of 900 years of suffering, on the injustice of children punished for nothing they had done, for the simple fact of being loved when someone else was not. These versions ask what kind of world allows such things, what kind of magic operates without moral compass, what kind of god or gods permit such suffering. The questions have no answers, or too many answers, or answers that depend on what you believe about the nature of reality, the operation of justice, the presence or absence of divine oversight. Still other versions emphasize the endurance, the survival, the fact that the children stayed together, stayed human in their hearts, stayed themselves despite 900 years of transformation. These versions tell the story as one of hope, of resilience, of love stronger than magic, stronger than time, stronger than death. These versions end not with the dying, but with the reunion, with the siblings together finally in whatever afterlife they believed in, whole and young and human again, free of the curse, free of suffering, free. The truth, if there is truth in stories this old, this mythologized, is probably all of these and none of these, is more complicated than any single version can convey, is both darker and brighter than legend suggests. 4 children were cursed. They endured 900 years. They died as soon as they became human again. These are the facts, stark and simple and terrible in their simplicity. Everything else, the meaning, the moral, the message, is interpretation, is what we bring to the story rather than what the story brings to us. The story spread beyond Ireland, beyond the lands where it originated, carried by monks and travelers and traders, transformed as it traveled, picking up new details, losing old ones, blending with other stories, until sometimes it was hard to recognize. In some versions, the children become different birds, eagles or ravens or doves. In some versions, there are only 2 children, or 6, or a number chosen for symbolic resonance rather than narrative accuracy. In some versions, the stepmother is punished, transformed herself, suffering as she made others suffer. In some versions, she is forgiven, redeemed, saved by the same magic she wielded cruelly. The core remains constant, though, across all variations. Children cursed, transformed into birds, enduring impossible lengths of time, dying when finally returned to human form. This core speaks to something deep in human consciousness, some fear we all share of losing ourselves, of being trapped in forms not our own, of suffering that extends beyond any reasonable duration, of love that persists despite everything working against it. The story became a parable about many things, about the dangers of jealousy, about the power of curses, about the importance of family, about endurance in the face of suffering, about transformation and identity and the question of what makes us human, about time and memory and the weight of centuries, about love and loss and the price of survival. Each age found in it what that age needed to find, what that age feared or hoped or believed, and the story served all these purposes without insisting on any single interpretation. Children still hear the story, though now it comes in picture books, in animated films, in classroom lessons about Irish mythology. The suffering is softened for young audiences. the 900 years condensed to montage, the ending made bittersweet rather than simply bitter, the reunion in death emphasized over the dying itself. This is perhaps appropriate. Children should not be burdened with the full weight of the story, the true depth of suffering it contains. They can learn that later if they want to, if they return to the story as adults and find layers they missed as children. The lakes still exist, all three of them, though under different names sometimes, with changed shores, with altered ecosystems, with no memory of swans that were once human. Lake Derravaragh is popular with tourists now, people coming to see the supposed site where the Children of Lir lived as humans, where they were cursed, where their father searched for them. The lake has no knowledge of this, continues being a lake, supporting fish and birds and plant life, serving human purposes of recreation and water supply and aesthetic beauty, indifferent to the stories told about it. The Sea of Moyle, the strait between Ireland and Scotland, remains as hostile as ever to those who try to cross it, though modern ships navigate it easily, though ferries run regular routes, though what was once a barrier is now merely an inconvenience, a stretch of water to be crossed on the way to somewhere else. The sea does not care about human stories, has never cared, continues its eternal work of eroding coastlines, moving water, supporting life, demonstrating power. Lake Glora is hardest to find, remote as it always was, accessed only by those willing to hike through difficult terrain, to venture far from roads and settlements, to seek out wild places. Few make the journey. Those who do find a lake much like any other lake, beautiful but not extraordinary, peaceful but not magical, offering nothing except what all lakes offer: reflection, stillness, the simple presence of water in a world that needs water to survive. But sometimes, rarely, someone standing on the shore of Glora hears something, feels something, experiences a moment of connection to the past, to the story, to the 4 children who died here over 1,000 years ago. It is not supernatural, probably, not magical or miraculous, or anything beyond normal human sensitivity to place and history. But it feels something, like the story reaching forward through time, like the Children of Lir speaking across centuries, like memory made manifest. And perhaps that is what endures, not the physical graves or the scattered stones, or even the bones dissolved into soil, but the story itself, the fact of the telling, the human need to preserve and pass forward accounts of suffering endured, of love persisted, of lives lived under impossible conditions, of ordinary people, children really, just children, faced with extraordinary trials and somehow, impossibly, surviving. We tell the story because it reminds us that suffering can be borne. We tell it because it shows love persisting despite everything,